In this video, I'm going to walk through how to create an XSD schema using the XML Designer in VisualStudio.net. The XML Designer is a visual way to define an XSD by dragging and dropping items from the toolbox onto the design surface. Behind the scenes, an XSD is created for you, hiding the majority of complexity involved with designing an XSD. If you've ever done one by hand, you'll come to appreciate this tool very quickly. If you're unfamiliar with XSDs, think of them as classes that will actually define what your XML should look like once it's created and properly formed. So what we'll do is define what the XML should look like, but not the actual data. In a future walkthrough, we'll take a look at how to create an XML document based upon the schema that we're going to create in this walkthrough. So the first thing that I did was I created a Windows form project called XML Books, and what I want to do is add an XML schema called Book List Schema, and I'll actually add a file to the Solution Explorer called booklistschema.xsd. And what I'm going to do is create three complex types, one for a book object, one for an author object, and one for a publisher object. And we'll relate these once we create elements that implement these complex types. So what I'm going to do is drag and drop, first of all, a complex type, and this will be the publisher. And we're going to add some sub-elements to this complex type. For example, publisher's ID, which will make a long, and then the publisher's name, which will also make a string. And then what I'm going to do is add an attribute. I can do this one of many ways, as I'll show you in a future video on attributes. But we'll go ahead and drag and drop an item to the design surface, and we'll call this country, and we'll leave it as string. Now what I can do, now that I've created this attribute, is actually drag and drop it into the complex type. So this will show up as an attribute of publisher as opposed to an element, a sub-element of publisher. Okay, so that was our first case. The next case is I'm going to create a book complex type, but the book is going to have an attribute group. So instead of just a single attribute, it's going to have a number of attributes that are tied together. And so what I'll do is drag and drop an attribute group and call it book attributes. And here I will add some attributes called ISBN, which will be a string. I'll add a publish date, which will be just a date. And I'll add price, which will be just a decimal. So now what I'll do is actually add a complex type for the book itself. We'll call this book. And we're going to add some elements, sub-elements, like book ID, which will be a long. Another element called pub ID, which will be a foreign key relationship, which will be a long. And another foreign key relationship called author ID, which will also be a long. And then we're also going to give it a title for this book. And I'm going to select a string for that. And then what I'm going to do is add in an attribute group. And when I do that, and I'll pull this up here, you'll notice that it automatically creates a link to an attribute group, which is blank. But we want this attribute group here that we've just created to be used instead. So in order to accomplish this, what I'll do is type in book attributes, the same name that I gave to my attribute group here, and when I hit the tab, you'll notice that it adds a reference equals book attribute, and it creates kind of a copy of the book attribute group. So I can use this attribute group a number of different times. It's kind of a global reference that I can use multiple times in different elements and in different complex types and things of that nature. So I'm going to try and rearrange some things. To do this, I'm going to right-click and select Auto Arrange, and when I do, notice that it puts things out in kind of a nicer order for me. The next thing that I'm going to do is now create an author. But before I do that, I'm going to create a contact complex type. And this is turning out to be a rather complex schema, but I want to show you all the different things that you can do with the designer here, at least in an overview. So I'm going to add an element called address, one called city, and one called state, and one called zip. Now, I want to do something special with the state one after I finish this one here. Great. Okay. I want to go in and define some extra information about the state. For example, I want to say that the state can only be 2 characters wide, and I even want to provide an enumeration of just the 50 states that are in the United States. So to do this, what I'm going to do is add a simple type, and I'm going to call this state, and I'm going to move the position of the window so you can get a better look at what I'm doing. And so the first thing that I want to do is define some facets of this simple type called state. And the first thing I'm going to do is select the length property. I'm going to say can only be 2 characters wide. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is drag and drop a facet object on here. Now notice that I can just right-click and select facet, or I can drag and drop it from the toolbox, whichever method that you prefer. And so, for example, I'm going to select several enumerations here for the different states, and we won't do all 50 right now, I assure you. Texas, and we'll do one more. We'll do New York. Okay. So, if you properly read and validate this schema for a given XML document, that means that when you get to the state, you can use this information to populate a drop-down list box, or at least validate that one of the 50 states are selected from this list of enumerations that we've given here. Now what I'm going to do is go back to my contact complex type and select state in order to make our state implement the simple type we created called state. So now that I've created the contact complex type, what I need to do is add one last complex type that represents the author himself. So we'll call this author. And now we'll do things like author ID, which we'll define that to be an element, and a long. And we'll add another one called author name. And leave that as a string. And also we want contact information about this author. So what we'll do is select element, put contact info, and we'll select contact. And when we do, notice again that it creates sort of link to a reference to our contact complex type that we've created earlier. So now that we've created all the complex types that we need, we want to create several instances of these that we can actually link together and add some related information to. In order to do that, I'm actually going to create elements that represent these global types, these global complex types that are within our schema. So we're kind of running out of room here. What I want to show you is this neat little navigation tool at the bottom, which allows me to kind of drag and drop around, and when I do, it moves around the whole window to find some empty space. What I think I'm going to do, though, is just move things on my own, kind of out of the way here, and then at some point in the future let it auto-arrange these. So what I'm going to do first is drag and drop an element object, and this is going to be my author. In order to denote that this is an instance of my author complex type, what I'll do is select author. And when I do, notice that it kind of did the same thing as before, where it created an instance of some of these things. Let me move this out of here. Like an instance of the author ID, author name, but I can't change this because these are defined elsewhere. They're not defined in this element. They're actually defined in the complex type, and this is global to the entire schema. It also has a reference to the contact complex type, which, as we see this little link here, we have what's called a nested hierarchy. So now we're going to also, for this, define a key. So I'm going to drag and drop a key, and the edit key pops up. It suggests the name, which we'll accept. Fields, is it nullable? I'm going to say no. I'm actually going to select the dataset's primary key and select OK. And so we're going to do something similar now for the publisher. And we probably could have named these something a little bit different. I chose to name the complex type and the object itself the same thing. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I'm sure the IDE will let me know if it is. I'm going to move that off to the side. And notice that it pretty much did the same thing, where it created an instance of all the items, including the attribute for the publisher. And then finally what we're going to do is drag and drop an element for the book itself. And we will select type, complex type book, and notice that it has its own little region, and we're going to move this down somewhere here. And so the book now has some important information about it that you can see. It has also this nested hierarchy here. We're going to drag and drop a key into here, and we're also going to drag and drop a key into the publisher ID. So it's going to create a key on pub ID. Okay, so now what I've got are three elements that all have instances of the, they all have primary keys, and we're going to create relationships. But the first thing I feel compelled to do is to clean things up a little bit, so I'm going to hit Auto Arrange. All right, and so things look a little bit nicer here, and I can scroll in a more linear fashion at this point. So I'm going to scroll over to try and find the elements that I created. There they are. They're all lined up nicely together. And I'm going to create a relationship between the book elements and, as we see here, the publisher ID and the author ID. I'm going to drag this down to make it a little more obvious what I'm doing here on one screen. So what I'd like to do now is drag and drop a relation onto the book object, and an edit relation box pops up. You can't see the whole thing in the view here, but basically near the bottom is just an OK, cancel, and help button. So it suggests a name for this relationship. What is the parent element? In this case, we'll go from authors to books. So I'm going to select author and the author key, and the child element will be the book, and it suggests that the key fields, author ID, the foreign key field, author ID, create foreign key constraint only, and then there's some rules. I'm going to leave the rules at their default level, and we'll talk about all these things. In fact, we'll talk about everything in great detail throughout the remainder of this series. And then here at the bottom, I'll drag this up. I'm going to click the OK button. And what will happen now is that a relationship will be created between the author table and the book table based on the primary key, foreign key relationship between these two. I use the word table because it's very analogous to a table. In fact, as we generate a data set out of this, we'll refer to them as tables when they're in the data set. So I apologize for using the wrong terminology in this context, but I think you get the idea. It's almost exactly like defining tables in a relational database structure. So at any rate, we have created a relationship between author and book, and you can see that there is a one-to-many relationship. So in other words, one author will have many books. And we could right-click on this and select Edit the Relation to pop the Edit Relation box back up, but we don't need that right now. We're also going to create another relation between the book and the publisher. And so it's pretty much the same thing. The parent element is the publisher. The publisher key 1 is the only one, so it's selected by default. And the child element is the book. And in this case, it didn't automatically find what it should use as a foreign key field, so we're going to select it, and we're going to also click for the dataset properties to create foreign key constraint, and then we'll select OK at the bottom. And we'll notice here that it has created quite a web of relationships between these objects. But be that as it may, what we've done is create a book object with a relationship to a publisher element and an author element. Now, why did we do all this? Again, schemas are sort of like classes in so much that they define what an XML document will look like once it's serialized out. To see what we would have had to do in order to create an XSD by hand, let's switch over to the XML view of the schema. And now we can see why, even though it took us a long time to get to this point, it was still a lot easier than typing all of this schema information out by hand, having to remember all of the special nuances and all the adornments that are on the XSD. But this defines everything about what we've created here. So in and of itself, there's really nothing that great about this. We've created an XSD document. We can pat ourselves on the back. But the true value comes in when we actually go to turn this into a data set so that we can use it within our application, or in order to create an XML document. And these will be the next two walkthroughs based on what we've done here. So if you stuck around, you watched this whole video, don't forget to watch the next two videos about creating an XML document based on this schema, and also how to generate a data set from this schema. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a lot about the XML designer and how to create a schema using it.